That night the wind came, and the cold along with it. Branches snapped and blew through the backyard like toys pulled on a string. The wind screamed through the house, pushing furniture across the floor. Daddy, Mama, Alice, and I huddled in the parlor, as far away from the chimney as possible, which was blowing in snow and ice, covering the house in a thin layer of dust. We pressed together under blankets to keep ourselves warm, and exhausted, we fell asleep. The next morning, Mama silently stared out the window. Alice rubbed sleep from her eyes and went to Mama. She struggled against the wind blowing through the parlor and grabbed Mama by the hip. "City up and burn to the ground," Mama said to Alice, pointing towards the city. "Should we pray?" Alice asked meekly. "If you want," Mama said, turning away from the window. Daddy finally crawled out from under the blankets, his eyes bloodshot and cheeks windburned. "We're all of us gonna stay put," he said, shivering. He sucked in his upper lip, pulling his mustache into his mouth the way he did when he was nervous. A deafening gust hit the house and flung Daddy to the ground. Mama lost her balance and grabbed at Alice for support, but by accident tripped her and sent her violently crashing head first into the side table. Alice's head hit its hard oak corner in a bad way, and she fell limp on the ground. Mama screamed, neither did Alice move. Her forehead bruised under the skin, and she lay on the ground, clenching her teeth at odd intervals, squeezing her fists in sync. A second bigger rush of air pounded through the room without stopping. All throughout the house, furniture slammed against the walls. I pulled a blanket over myself and crawled to Alice to protect her. It was loud as a train. Warm liquid drained from my ears, and when I wiped it away, I saw blood on my hands. I inched closer to Alice when the wind stopped. Mama very calmly stood up with her eyes forward, set straight an overturned chair, and sat, staring at the window with perverse calm. I came to my senses as Daddy scooped up Alice. Her eyes were half open and darted around at all angles, pupils wide. A strange sound came from her, but it surely wasn't words. The sight of her made my throat close and my tongue swell. My cheeks were hot with tears. Let's Daddy said, panting, holding a limp Alice in his arms. Let's see if we can start a fire. I stared at him in shock. Mama gazed out the window. "And I mean now!" Daddy shouted as his eyes betrayed panic. I slowly walked towards Mama and put my hand on her shoulder. She flinched, neither did she look at me. As if moving on a track, she got up and glided into the living room. I followed her, Daddy close behind me, gasping in staccato breaths, whispering to limp Alice. In the living room, a fire wouldn't take. I struck the last match head to the wood, but it wouldn't succumb to a spark. "Daddy, it isn't working!" I shouted in frustration, but to no response. I turned and Daddy had propped Alice up on the Chesterfield like a doll, speaking to her as if she were just fine. Spit pooled in the corners of her mouth, and the bruise on her forehead grew bigger. Mama smiled at me with only her lips, her eyes staring 1,000 yards behind me. Slowly, an eerie sucking noise came from the chimney. It was wet, like a person slurping soup. Cold sweat dripped down my neck when a burst of flames shot out of the fireplace in a steady, roaring stream. I fell back on all fours and attempted to crawl away, the fire burning away my eyelashes. Daddy covered Alice with his body as Mama just rocked back and forth, calmly watching the scene unfold. The stream of fire shot through the room but consumed nothing, then got sucked up the chimney as soon as it had appeared. Panting, I pulled myself up and approached the fireplace with my hands up in defense. A sloshing noise burped down the chimney, getting louder as it approached. There was one final loud and an overweight man slid out of the chimney and into our living room, like a calf spewing from its mother's womb. He was squeezed into a tight navy blue military uniform. He wore a heavy wool jacket with a white leather bandolier over a gold ruffled vest. A scabbard sheathed an ornate briquette with a pearl handle. "Oh, my hat!" he muttered to himself, wiping goo off his face and shoulders. He reached his stubby arm into the chimney and pulled out a feathered dragoon helmet. "Much better," he assured himself as he fixed it in place on his freakishly round head. His eyes were tiny and set far too closely together above a pig-like nose. A yellowish-white handlebar mustache, heavy with translucent ooze, drooped from his upper lip. "You look here, fella," Daddy growled. "Not at all, I assure you I'm quite all right, notwithstanding the weather, of course," the man squeaked. He affectedly raised out his palm upward like a gentleman asking for a dance. "Frederick, a handkerchief, please," he said as he motioned towards the back of the room. Slowly, Daddy and I turned and beheld a boy standing rigidly upright in the corner by the grandfather clock. He wore round glasses, and a small shadow of an immature mustache blurred his upper lip. His cheeks were tubercularly rosy, and his face was covered in a thin, viscous film. An oversized, starched collar hid the boy's too long neck, tucked over a maroon jacket. He wore long mustard yellow shorts and buckled, worn leather shoes. "Frederick!" the officer said impatiently, still holding his palm in the air. A ticking noise came from the boy, like a clock wound too tight. His shoulders bobbed up and down, and his head shook back and forth until a ting rang from inside him, and he snapped into place. Mechanically, he walked across the room, his head set in a fixed position, staring at nothing. He rigidly pulled a handkerchief from inside his jacket and forcefully set it in the officer's hand. Once his task was complete, he froze. "Thank you, Frederick," the officer said warmly. Mama sighed in her chair, oblivious to what was unfolding. "Who the hell are you?" Daddy asked, voice quivering. The officer's face took a warm smile. "Je m'appelle Gaspard Dumont," he bowed. Daddy didn't move. "And allow me to introduce Frederick, and let me present my beautiful wife," he said, looking behind us. "Stop your formalities," a tiny woman croaked as she entered the living room. She was no taller than Daddy's waist, with sausage-like arms and legs. In a swollen hand, she held a long cigarette holder and brought it to her clownishly made-up face. A film of goo covered her from head to toe, leaving a wet trail behind her. "Oh, don't mind her. She's merely anxious," Officer Dumont stage whispered to me with a smirk and a wink. "Anxious?" she squeaked. "Furious!" she shouted, exhaling a massive plume of cigarette smoke, her pearls rattling on her neck. "I'm expected to smile and say, 'Yes, sir, no, ma'am, thank you, sir, thank you, ma'am,' while our dunce of a son tarnishes the Dumont name," she cried. She quickly caught herself and forced an insincere smile at Daddy. "Not that I don't think Alice isn't just wonderful. Although she does look a bit under the weather now, doesn't she?" she said, motioning to Alice. Saliva bubbled in the corner of Alice's mouth, and her face drooped on the right side. "What's the occasion?" Mama slowly asked, with a giant, vacant smile. Her face had become insanity. There was a pause, followed by Officer Dumont's nervous laughter. He smiled at Mama as if to ask if she were joking. When he realized she wasn't, he cleared his throat. "Why, your daughter's wedding day," he condescended. Mama's head fell forward and she slumped in her chair. She clenched the arms of the chair and slowly let out a wild scream, tilting her head upwards as she cried to the ceiling. Frederick stayed motionless, staring at the wall. Officer Dumont frowned with concern, while Lady Dumont covered a laugh with her tiny hand. "Helen!" Daddy cried, running to her as she screamed. He put his arms on her shoulder when she lunged back with her hands in the air and clawed at his face with her fingernails. Daddy yelped in agony and fell to the floor. She'd badly scratched his eye. Blood and milky intraocular fluid ran down his already bloodied cheek. Mama bolted and ran to the chimney. She placed both palms against the brick, tilted back, and slammed her forehead against it repeatedly. "Mama!" I screamed. I jumped towards her, but Officer Dumont grabbed my shoulder. His hand clawed into my collarbone, and a freezing heat singed my skin with frostbite. "She needs a moment," Officer Dumont said strangely. Mama smacked her head against the brick again and again, raving insanely. Daddy writhed on the ground, clenching his eye, while I was held in place by Officer Dumont's sinister grip. Mama turned around and stared at us with wide eyes. Her forehead oozed blood from a deep bruise, and her mouth was wide open. "Ah!" she screamed. She spun around, ducked into the fireplace, and climbed up the inside of the chimney demonically, as if lifted by some wicked hand. Her screams bled through the wall, up to the ceiling, where they stopped and seemed to hang, progressing no higher. Apparently, she'd gotten stuck. The 5 of us didn't move as we listened to her wail. Ahem! Interrupted a deep voice behind us. If it's all the same, Gaspard, the children and I cannot stay late. I must insist we stick to our itinerary. Against the wall stood a skinny, broad-shouldered man in an olive green suit. He had high cheekbones and a severe part, slicked back with pomade. 2 sets of twins in matching blue outfits stood before him, perfectly dressed as if waiting for an artist to paint their portraits. To his right stood a woman in a dark red dress, her blonde hair done up in curls. The family was coated in a layer of clear grease, and they looked very unwell. They were unperturbed by Mama's muffled screams coming out of the chimney. "Oh, Monsieur Levesque! Of course!" blurted Officer Domont skittishly. I wasn't sure if you'd make it." "Well, we made it," Levesque said tersely. "Children!" he commanded harshly. "Go set the table." The children quickly left the room. "Marie, see to our gracious host's face." His wife silently went to Daddy, who was breathing heavily on the floor. She brought him to his feet and led him into the water closet. "Lady Domont, why don't you make the bride the least bit presentable?" he ordered with a grimace. Lady Domont looked to her husband to defend her, but he stared at the ground sheepishly. She sighed and pulled Alice off the couch by her ankles, bouncing her head against the floor as she waddled out of the room. "Oh, you horrible!" I screamed, but was cut off as Monsieur Levesque viciously grabbed my forearm and pulled it roughly, popping my shoulder, burning it with cold. "You boy," he barked at me. "Tend to the groom." Frederick, the automaton, remained locked in place. "Domont, I will have 1 brandy while we wait," he growled. Officer Domont snapped into action and led him into the kitchen, leaving me with Frederick. Terrified of Monsieur Levesque's retribution, I approached the young man as Mama moaned in the walls. I muttered as I put my hand on his shoulder. I quickly pulled it away, a trail of freezing slime connecting us. I wiped the goo onto my pants and got closer to Frederick, attempting to hear him breathe or catch him blinking, but he did no such thing. He simply stood, locked in place, his mouth half open and his eyes glossy, like a doll's. I raised my hand and put it against his chest to find a heartbeat. He was ice cold, but I held my hand against him all the same. I recoiled in horror, but he looked so lifelike, so human. I gasped, but was cut short. "Boy!" screamed Monsieur Levesque. "Unbelievable failing such a simple task, and on Frederick's special day no less." He clenched the glass of brandy in his hand, and it shattered, slicing open his flesh. A dark green ooze spilled from the wound, and he quickly wrapped it in an oily handkerchief. "Frederick, come now!" he shouted. Frederick whirred to life and trotted out of the room. "You too," snarled Levesque. Terrified, I followed him into the dining room. The entire party was seated at the table before an elaborate banquet. The room was bizarrely large, alien to the house. 3 gold candelabras glowed on the table. Daddy's body was completely wrapped in gauze, with no break in the fabric to see or breathe. Blood seeped out of the gauze that hid his eyes and cheeks. He didn't appear to be breathing and seemed to be propped up by a wood board in the back of his shirt. His arms were tied to his chair. And Alice, oh poor Alice. She hunched forward at the head of the table, drool dripping from her open mouth. Her eyes were half open, and she twitched strangely. The bruise on her forehead had turned to a deep purple. Lady Domont had dressed her in an oversized wedding gown, dirty at the collar and fraying at the edges. She looked like a doll in human clothes. Frederick mechanically took a seat next to her and froze. His gears stopped whirring. Well, why don't you take a seat, dear boy? Officer Domont pleaded. The sets of twins had their heads bowed. Madame Levesque picked at her thumb nervously. Lady Domont rolled her eyes and blew a ring of smoke, completely aggravated. Mama's pained cries wheezed from the walls. Slowly, I sat, and the party immediately began feasting. They ate ravenously without speaking. Officer Domont stuffed glistening meats into his mouth, smacking his lips as he licked his piggy fingers. Monsieur Levesque gnawed on a bone like an animal, revealing a set of razor-sharp teeth as he broke through to the marrow. The sets of twins ate in perfect unison, mirroring each other's movements. Madame Levesque had dropped her quiet pretense and cupped soup with her hands like a dehydrated man who found an oasis. Mama groaned in the walls as Lady Domont ripped open a chicken's ribcage and pulled at the meat with her baby teeth. Frederick shook, eyes blinking in unbroken rhythm like a metronome. The cacophony of insanity broke me. I screamed psychotically, "Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!" The volume of my voice tore at my throat. I tasted blood. No one looked up. Daddy and Alice were motionless. "Out! Out now!" I cried. They continued to eat voraciously. In a frenzy, I grabbed a candelabra and waved it at the uninvited guests. It didn't stir them. Wind blew through the house. Mama had gone silent. Furious, I pushed the candelabra down onto the table, and the cloth caught fire. But they continued to stuff themselves. The fire grew in intensity as the guests began to melt like wax. They liquefied over their food. Frederick's face dissolved, melting down his collar onto his blazer, revealing spinning gears, pulsing springs, and a human heart, which had caught fire. Daddy was engulfed in flames, neither did he struggle. The set of twins did not scream. They kept eating in unison, their silverware glowing hot in the flames as they disintegrated. Alice drooled in her chair. She didn't catch fire. It licked at everything around her, but she seemed protected by an invisible orb. I reeled back towards the door, my hands protecting my face. The hair on my arms began to singe, choking me with an acrid smoke. "Alice! Alice!" I cried. Blood dried on her head. She drooled like an imbecile. "I'll be back! I'll come back for you!" I backed out of the house and into the night. Wind pelted me with ice, nicking my skin and drawing blood. The house was an inferno. And I wept. I wept. I don't know how long I stood watching. The house collapsed and smoldered into embers, the wind and ice slowly putting out the blaze. All that remained was the table with puddles of wax beneath it. Alice was there. She hadn't moved. I approached her. Her food was untouched. "It's okay now, Alice," I whispered. I took her plate and began to eat. "This story must be told."